Hey, everybody. Happy Wednesday. How are you? If you're here, you can go ahead and say hi in the comments. I'll get started here in just a minute. Wait for another person or two to hop on. All right, before we begin, we will go over supplies. When you signed up, you should have gotten access to download this supply list and the video link. If you've found this video, obviously that link has worked, so yay. What I am going to be creating on today is Canson XL watercolor paper. I'm using a 9x12. You can obviously use any size. Any brand is fine. I typically recommend this because it's fairly inexpensive. Most of the art stores have this 40% off or buy one, get one half off fairly often. And I really like the way the watercolor behaves on this paper, so I highly recommend it, but you can use any watercolor paper. As far as watercolor paint, my two favorites are, this is a brand called Prima Confections or Prima Marketing Art Philosophy, and they come in different palettes. This is a Tropicals palette. But this is a great starter set. The colors are nice, brightly pigmented, and they behave well like watercolors. They lift well, they blend well. I really like these. And my absolute favorite are Dr. P.H. Martin's Radiant Watercolor. These are concentrated. They're already in liquid form. So I really enjoy these. But you can use any watercolor that you have, and that would be fine. I will be creating orange hibiscus flowers, but you can even change the colors. The colors that I pulled out is, we needed a pink or red, so I have a scarlet, an orange, so I pulled out a tangerine. This is daffodil yellow. We needed a green, so this is olive green, and then antelope brown. But the beautiful thing about creating flowers is you really can change up your palette to almost anything and it'll work. So your green can be different from my green. Hibiscus flowers come in orange, yellow, pink, red. So don't be afraid to change up the color if you want to. I'm going to use orange as my base color and then yellow and scarlet for some details. And then of course we're creating with watercolor, so you're going to need water. Paper towels are handy. I've got a palette to put my watercolor on. You can also just use a plate. And then you're going to need some brushes. I almost always use a round medium-sized brush. This is a size 6 Royal Langnickel Aquilon brush. And maybe I'll pull out a fine detail brush. So this is a number 1. But really, I just suggest having a larger brush and a detail brush. I almost always use rounds when I'm using watercolor. But use what works for you. Having a heat gun or a hair dryer is handy when working with watercolor. I don't know how much we're going to need it today, but if you have one available, don't be afraid to pull it out. And then I do mention painter's tape. So sometimes when you're working on a surface, ooh, I bumped my camera, sorry about that. Sometimes when you're working on a surface, your watercolor paper can curl up if it gets too wet. Or if you want to frame out an edge, you can use your painter's tape for that. I'm going to go without painter's tape today. And one thing I did not put on my supply list that you are going to need is a pencil. So we're going to sketch in the flowers before we get started. So that's what you'll need that pencil for. And then this was just the sample that I created for tonight's class, but I am drawing this from scratch, so it'll be a little different. Don't be afraid to make yours a little different as well. All right. As we're working, if you have any questions or comments, don't be afraid to put those in the chat below. But let's go ahead and get started. All right. The first thing that I'm going to do before I sketch is I'm going to get my watercolors out and ready here. So if you have watercolor on a palette and you want to get it wet so that it's ready for you, now's a good time to do that. So I've got my orange, my red, my yellow, my green, and my brown. And I'm going to need very little of the brown, red, and yellow, to be honest. So don't go crazy with your paint. Save as much as you can for another time or a second project. All right, so my watercolor is ready. Now we're going to go into sketching. All right, so let me think how the best way to do this is. I'm going to try to keep this sample somewhat in frame just so you guys can see where I'm going with my lines. All right, so I think this I did in kind of an L shape, just so I don't have a duplicate of the exact same painting. I'm going to do a reverse L here. So I'm going to start in this lower right hand corner. The first part that I'm going to find is the center of the flower here. So I'm going to kind of just draw in my center. I am going to push fairly hard with my pencil, which is not ideal in watercolor, but I want you to be able to see it as the viewer. So as you're sketching, draw very, very lightly. I'm drawing harder than normal, and so my lines will show up in my painting. You don't want that to happen. All right, so here's my center. This is going to be my first flower. And then in the center of the flower, we've got this kind of, I think it's called a stamen that pokes out in a hibiscus. So I'm going to draw kind of a little round area there, and then just two lines that kind of come to a point at the end. You can see that okay, I think. All right, so that's the center of my first flower, and we find our center so that we can surround it with petals. On a traditional hibiscus, we're going to make 5 petals, and so I'm going to start down here with my my biggest petal, and this will be the one closest to us. So you just kind of want to draw a squiggly, rounded petal line because it's got lots of folds and nooks and crannies. And then kind of where these lines fold, like where they dip in, we're just going to add a little striation line heading towards the center. And that's just to help us understand placement of shades and colors. All right, so there's our first leaf, and we're just going to work around this center, or petal. I called it a leaf, but there's our first petal, and I'm just going to add another one. Nice wavy shape. And if your shape is different from mine, do not let that stress you out. The important part is that it comes to the center. You don't want to overlap these. These are large petals that kind of take up their own space here. And then directly across, I'm going to draw another one. This one I'm going to have curved down just a little bit. And as you can see, I'm just kind of free forming that shape, and wherever I have a little wiggle inward, I'm just going to draw some lines. And then now I know up here I need 2 petals because we're going to make 5. And sorry if you can hear my dog barking. I'm telling you, every time I go live, something happens and they feel like they need to bark. Anyway, so we've got 3 petals here. I need to add 2 at the top. So I'm going to come about halfway of my center, and these petals I'm going to make a little shorter, a little stout. because these are kind of facing away. They're bending outward. So I'm going to do the same process wherever it kind of dips in. I'm going to add those little lines. And remember, just sketch lightly. And now I know for my final petal, I can start and end in between these two shapes here. So I'm going to keep this one also kind of short because I know it's facing away a little bit. So that is our first hibiscus flower. If you are not a drawer, I am going to do another one so you can watch again if you are struggling a little bit with that. Sometimes I have a tracer, but I feel like these flowers are fairly easy as far as most flowers go. All right, so I'm going to add my second one right up here. So I'm going to find my center again, just kind of making a circle. Then we're going to add that stamen in. So we've got a circle and then a line that kind of comes to a tip at the end. It's almost like a little hummingbird nose, right? And then I am going to add in my petals. So we'll start here. This one is going to come behind this flower a little bit, and this one is my bottom petal. It's going to be the largest. So wherever it dips inward, I'm going to just add in a few lines. And then I'm just going to work my way around. So over here, let's have a nice curved petal. And then directly across. And then I know here at the top I need to add 2 more because we're going to have 5. So start a petal kind of here. My 2 at the top are going to be thinner or shorter than the ones at the bottom because they're facing away. Not necessarily thinner, just shorter. And then the same thing here. Actually, I'm going to change that a little bit. So yeah, don't be afraid to edit your flower a little bit if something looks funny. These are just sketches. All right, so those are going to be my 2 main flowers. And then just like on my sample, I'm going to add in just a little flower bud. So a stem and then a football shape and then kind of a few curvy lines in there. And then we'll have a leaf. So you can just draw a leaf shape. Let's see, I'm not crazy about this one. And then I'm just going to add in some leaf shapes all the way around here. If you want to add a center line, that's not a bad idea. And leaves around a hibiscus do come out to a point. So they are pointed leaves. All right, you can add as many or as few as you want. I might make this a little wider. So now's the time, just kind of finish up your sketch a little bit. Adjust anything that you want to. Remember, sketch lightly. I sketched very heavily, so I'm actually probably going to, now that we've talked about the sketch, I'm just going to lighten this just a little bit with my eraser. just because I don't want too much of that to show through. I don't recommend using an eraser too much on watercolor paper because it will mess with the sizing of the paper a little bit. But it was pretty important for you to see the sketch, right? So now that we've got it, I'm just lightening just a little. All right, for the most part, we are done with our pencil. We shouldn't need that for much of anything. Let me just make sure there's nobody asking any questions. All right, so let's get moving with our watercolor. The first step here we already did was draw. The second step, if you want to eliminate some of this white on the background, you could create a wash. I'm not going to do that because I like the white in this piece, but now would be the time to do that if you just want to add a little wash on the background. I am going to skip that because I like the white. All right, so we're going to get started. We're going to start working wet on dry, which means wet watercolor on dry watercolor paper. And so what I'm going to do is make sure my brush is clean. All right, we are going to start with kind of a medium tone for our watercolor. We don't want it too light and we don't want it too dark. But what I'm going to do is I am going to start filling in this flower. Just oops, you know what? I started with my red. I guess this one down here is going to be a red. Whatever color you decide it's going to be, fill in a medium shade on dry paper. We're just filling in that leaf right now. So this was supposed to be orange, so I'm actually going to pull orange in there and switch my palette. Because I said I was doing orange, I need to do orange, right? All right. So I'm going to do like two or three of these, and then I'm going to come back and do another step. So what we're doing now is just filling in the petal with wet watercolor on dry paper, wet on dry. Just blending it out. We don't want it to be too wet. We're not worried about shading or anything like that right now. So I will do 3 petals at a time. And this ended up being kind of a salmon color, but I was going for orange, y'all. I just dipped my brush in the wrong color. All right. So now this is wet, and what I'm going to do is take a little bit of my red, and I'm going to dip it at the bottom, and I'm going to let that blend out. And you'll see it's about the same tone. I don't want it to be too much darker. I just want the color to be different. So I'm going to add a little red down there and let that blend outward into the wet orange color. All right, now I'm going to fill these two in at the top. And we're going to do the same thing. So I've laid down my orange, and then I'm just going to tap in a little bit of red here at the bottom and let that blend upward and outward. I'm going to do the same up top here. Nice medium tone, and then I'm going to fill in that space with my orange. And then once you've got your orange down, you can just tap in a little bit of red at the base and let it blend out. And that red, we call that touch wet on wet. So we're starting off with a wet on dry with our orange. Up here, I am going to try to avoid that stamen because it goes right through the center of my leaf. All right, so there is all of my orange, and then I'm going to tap in right at the bottom for my last three petals. And just let that blend outward. And you can see down at the bottom as it dries, you do get a nice variation in color. It's a little harder to see on camera. It's not picking up those nuances, but it does tend to be redder at the bottom and orange, more orange at the edges. All right, now for the sake of time, this is where I am going to get out my heat gun. I am going to go rather quickly. I just need to give this kind of a quick dry, and then we're going to add just a little layer on here. Right, as you can see, that didn't take very long. I tend to be more of an abstract painter, so I just need mostly dry. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this orange. I'm going to add in a little bit of red. I want this to be darker. I want it to be slightly darker in tone, about a shade or two. And I also just want the variation in color. So what I'm going to do now, I see a few more people hopping on. What I'm going to do now is we are going to add this wet on dry just to the center here, kind of pulling outward. And what I want you to try to create is those lines. That's what we're going for. So, and this is just going to be a little darker because we're using a darker color and we're also layering. So we're just pulling outward from that center and creating some depth here. And I mixed my color, I mixed the orange and the red. So this is just a little darker. And then I'm going to do the same thing up here. And then kind of with the exact same process, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to edge the curly part of my leaf, my petal, and then I'm going to pull down kind of in those places where there's a dip inward, and then just add some lines like that. So again, that was just kind of adding some color around the edge where I've got those pencil lines where I had my dips. I don't know what you call those, wrinkles, dips. So I'm just gonna kind of highlight those with the darker color and then pull downward. I'm still using the same size medium round brush as well. And I'm not overthinking this because my flowers are different. So some might have more color, some might have a little less. That's the fun thing about creating flowers. One of the reasons why I love creating flowers is because it's hard to go wrong. Surely the flower that you're creating exists out there somewhere. So this process is outline the petal, go over those pencil lines where your petal dips in, and then just adding a little shading and tone right there. And then of course we want to do that for our back flower as well. And you can see as you kind of work through these petals, it starts to take shape and look more and more like the flower we are going for. All right, now we are going to let our blooms dry a little bit, and we're going to move on to our leaves, and then we're going to come back to our blooms in a bit. So for our leaves, we're going to use two colors. We are going to use green and a pinch of brown. So I'm going to do here, make sure your brush is clean, because orange and green or red and green or pink and green, they don't play well together. But I'm still using this same medium-sized round brush here. And I'm going to get my color ready, going for just kind of a medium tone. And then I'm doing this right on dry. So what I'm going to do is just fill in the shape of that leaf. And these leaves on a hibiscus are kind of football shaped. So I'm going to fill in the shape of that leaf. And then while it's wet, I'm just going to kind of pull out the edges just a little bit, just a pinch, so you can see they've got kind of that shape, that jagged edge. And then I'm just going to repeat that for all my leaves. Right now we're just laying down color. So we're filling in that shape. And then I'm going to come back through and just pull out that edge ever so slightly, just to give it that little jaggy edge. And you're going to start to see, as I'm putting down this color, I'm not being completely even with it, right? Like, I'm just filling in the shape. It may have more or less color at the top than the bottom, and I am totally okay with that. That adds kind of a nice variation there. The main things that I want to keep in mind are that the shape is filled, and then I just can pull. I want to keep that kind of tip at the end, and then pull out just ever so slightly. When you get close to your petals, just be careful that you don't go right up as close as you can, but leave just the tiniest little edge. You do not want your color to bleed together. So you can see I just have the tiniest little white edge right in there. And if that's something that bothers you, if you don't like to have that little white space, we can always come back later and fill that in. But we don't want to do that while we're using large areas of color. I kind of had my leaves going every which way. And then up here at the top again, I'm going to be mindful that I don't touch the orange of my hibiscus. I'll leave a space if I can. And then I did have this little bud at the top. So if you created that as well, I am going to paint like half of this in with the green, and I'm going to leave half of it for a little bit of color. So, and then if you have not already, like I did not do my stems, I am just going to add in my stems real quick here. And I'm going to work really thin with just the tip of this brush when I add these in, just real thin. We are going to come back later and add details with our fine brush later. But right now I'm just kind of sketching in those lines. All right. So I'm going to set my green aside for now, and we are going to go back to the details in the balloons. All right, so for these details, so I've got my red. I'm just going to add another little drop or two of red. I want that nice and concentrated. And I'm using my fine brush here. So you can see, compared to the orange that I used, it's just about a shade darker there, a shade deeper. And I've got this nice fine tip. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull some lines out from the center on all my petals. Some nice thin lines. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the edges here. Just a few, not as many as we did earlier, but we're just adding smaller lines and details. And this just gives it a little more depth, a little more variation in layers. And layers is what watercolor does best. And of course, what I do to one, I need to do to the other. So I'm just going to add the little lines in the center. And then go back and add the finer lines around the edges. And so my hibiscus was mainly orange, and now I'm going around the edges with this scarlet here, just adding some finer details. You can always go back and refine your edges if you need to while we're doing this step. Here and there, I like to just add a little darker shade, just again for variation. right, I'm going to let what I did dry. I'm going to go back to the green. Again, I'm going to use my finer brush. Now I'm going to pull out some of the green that I used earlier. And I pretty much want the same color, except this time I am going to just add a touch of brown, just to change it ever so slightly. My brown is fairly thin down, so I'm not getting too much brown in there. Let me try this again. There. I just want to vary the color. It doesn't have to be, oops, I got into some red. That'll definitely change up my color. All right, so now I've got this brownish green, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the center line down my leaves. And this is wet on dry. My leaves are pretty much dry right now. And you can see my green touched my red. That's just going to make it more brown. And so that's kind of a happy accident. If you want to, you can go over your stems. I'm just adding a little variation in color. And then also with this brownish green, what I want to do is kind of come around anywhere the leaves meet the petals. I want to create a little shadow. So I'm just going to add a little darker color in there. Here I added it by the stem because this will be shadowed. So we're just kind of darkening, creating a little shadow area. Of course, you can touch up anywhere you feel like you need to on the leaves. Sometimes it's fun just to add in a little more color. Anytime you do wet on dry like this, you're going to see the edges of the paint. So just know that anywhere I put paint, it's going to create a kind of a sharp edge line. But this can be fun to kind of tap in just some dots. Sometimes leaves have, you know, just little details. Whatever you want to do. Little patches of color. Anywhere you want to add variation. I really like to embrace the characteristics of watercolor. So I like to have the edges and the little mistakes in the blends. I think that makes it a lot more fun. All right, so now we are going to go back to our bloom, and we've got two parts that we need to add. We need to add the stamen, and then we need to add kind of that center shadowy patch. Let me show you on the sample. So right here in the middle, we've got a darker brown area, and then we've got the stamen. Now earlier I did realize that I kind of had a little accident, and I did paint over my stamen here, but then I thought I'm not going to mention it because I'm going to show you, if you did the same thing, kind of how we can get some of that whiteness back. So what I'm going to do with my little detail brush here is I've got, just dip it in water, and I'm going to reactivate that little paint triangle that I want to be lighter, and then I'm just going to tap it with my paper towel, and I might be able to get some of that color up. If not, it's not a huge deal, but sometimes I do use that technique just to lift color. All right, so for our stamen, I'm going right in the yellow, and I am going to just fill in that stamen here with bright yellow. It's just a real thin part of the flower. And then down here, I'm going to do the same. Of course, it's going to look a little different because I'm doing the yellow over the orange. And then up around the point, the edge of my hummingbird beak here, I'm just going to tap in just some little dots right around the end. And down here on this one, because this yellow isn't very vibrant up against that orange, I might even add a little color change in there. So maybe I'll mix a little brown with that yellow just to make this a little more visible. So yeah, feel free to change up your color so you can see what you've got here. Maybe I'll make, this one's really hard to see. Maybe I'll just do red. There we go. All right, so I've got my 2 stamens. I fill in with yellow and then I just tap dots at the top, the end of my hummingbird beak. And then I'm going to go right into my brown here. And then I am going to just add some brown, the darkest brown here at the center. It's going to touch the yellow of the stamen, and that is okay. And then I'm going to mix red, maybe with another touch of brown here. Red and brown. I kind of want to have just an in-between shade between my darkest red and my darkest brown there. And then I'm going to kind of just add another circle around that brown stamen center there. And that's just going to be the center of our flower. And what I'm doing is I'm creating that edge first, that uneven flowery edge, and then I'm letting it touch in the center. So I'm kind of creating that outward edge first, and then I'll pull it in. I think I need my center just a little darker, so I am going to dip in the brown and I'm just going to touch it right there and let it do its watery colory thing. But that is up to you. And then the only other piece that I need to finish is just adding a touch of color up here in that little bloom. And so I'm going to add a little bit of this red with a little bit of my orange, and I'm just going to kind of touch in some color. This is dry, so it's not going to blend, and it's just going to look like it's kind of folded in that bloom there. And that is really it, guys. And so as you can see, I've done this in 2 different shapes. This one's got an extra little flower. You can certainly add in and change this design up any which way you want. Now that we're finished, you can look it over, you know, maybe see where you might want to add little touches here and there to finish it up, or you can leave it as is. So definitely make it your own. Please share it with me. My favorite thing about teaching classes is seeing what everybody creates. So don't hesitate to share with me. You can tag me at Painted Cicada or share in one of my groups. Or you can even just send me an email. My email is tara@paintedcicada.com. But I cannot wait to see what you create and all the flair that makes it yours. Thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you for joining me with my month of watercolor. I do have another event coming up. We're going to use, we're making a mixed media and watercolor plumeria. Super fun. That's coming up next week. You can check it out on my website at paintedcicada.com. And I will see you later. Have a good night, everybody.